And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, here in studio, Thabit Abdullah, professor of history at York University, who was born in Iraq. Mohammed Fadl, professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, who was born in Egypt. And Jehad Aliwewi, executive director of the Thorncliffe Neighborhood Office in Toronto. He was born in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. If he'd been born 6 months earlier, it would have been Jordanian-controlled. Today, it is administered by the Palestinian Authority. You're from a complicated part of the world.
I am.
You are.
I take pride in that.
I'll bet you do. We thank all three of you guys for coming in again tonight. You're not strangers to our audience or to this studio where you've been many times, but we have not had an opportunity to talk together as a group about the likes of what has been going on over the last couple of weeks. So Jehad, get us started. When you watch on television that which has transpired over the past couple of weeks, what does it all mean for you?
Well, I think it's kind of a dream coming true, or a wish and an aspiration for so many generations of Arabs that have eluded all of these generations, is kind of becoming closer and closer to reality. We're not there. I think what's happening in the Egyptian streets, in Cairo and Tahrir Square is an opportunity for us, and we should allow ourselves the moment to be inspired by what's happening. At the very basic levels of it, we're seeing masses that sustaining opposition to governments, brutal governments, that we've never seen the likes before. And that's wonderfully inspiring, very hopeful, and we're praying that this will conclude peacefully and successfully.
Mohammed, what do you think?
Not much more to add to that. I think obviously we're looking on with great hope, great admiration, tremendous awe for the bravery of the people the first couple of days, and now their incredible persistence and determination to see it through. One of the things that I notice that we as observers are very, we watch the ebbs and flows of the protests, and like we're watching a football game, and everybody's worried, oh, is the momentum, we've lost momentum, when are we going to get momentum back? And everybody's so excited, right, about how things are going. And it's difficult to remind oneself that this is a long struggle, that the Egyptian government is a very powerful state. To imagine that it's just going to disappear in 1 or 2 days is really naive.
If you like the analogy of a football game, I think 111 million people watched the Super Bowl a couple of days ago, and momentum turned on a dime.
Absolutely.
And that's happening here too, is it not?
I think actually I would say that it's really not a close game. It's deceptively close because the government is very powerful. But if you look at the important statistics, so to speak, I think they're losing in all the important statistics. And
the government is.
The government is. And we can talk about that probably in greater detail later.
We shall do so. Let me get Thabit on this. As you watch, what goes through your mind?
Yeah, I share my colleagues' euphoria on this. It's something that as I was growing up in Baghdad, something that we dreamt about and we spoke about continuously, my friends and I. But one thing, I don't want to repeat what they said. One thing that caught me during this whole process is that for several decades now, we've been talking about the Middle East, we've been talking about religious movements, we've been talking about sects and so forth. The Arab component seems to have gone to the background. It's very refreshing that suddenly a small spark takes place in Tunisia, and throughout the Arab countries there is an immediate connection with that, immediate response to it. Of course, mostly focused in the most important of the Arab countries, Egypt. But in practically every single one of the Arabic-speaking countries, there's an immediate connection with this event.
What does that tell you?
Proving that there is something called an Arab world, that this notion of an Arab identity in which the people of these regions connect with one another, feel that in one way or another their destinies are bound with one another, is still very much alive and well.
So Nasser was onto something.
Nasser was onto something, though I'm pretty suspicious of the way he used it.
Okay. Jehad, I want to go back to you. You are from the Palestinian territories, as we said at the beginning. What impact do you see the protests in Tunisia, in Egypt, having there?
Well, I think it's having great impact. Two important areas are worth highlighting here. One is the impact on the Palestinian Authority itself, because for a very long time, it really thought of both Tunisia and Egypt as the custodian of the Palestinian Revolution. For a very long time, the Palestinian Revolution was based in Tunisia.
And Arafat was
and
Egyptian.
That's right. So there is that historic, emotional connection that the Palestinians have to both countries. But at the very practical level is when the Palestinian Authority tried to ban all anti-Mubarak and the demonstrations and the demonstration in support of the opposition. Nobody really listened to the Palestinian Authority. There has been incredible demonstrations throughout the West Bank. But also the Palestinians are also saying, oh, someone else is demonstrating. There are streets that are sending signals of hopes other than Ramallah and Hebron and other parts of the West Bank. So people are feeling very hopeful that change in Cairo, change in Tunisia, will definitely bring about change in Palestine as well.
I'd like to just introduce a fourth guest who is going to join our assemblage here this evening, and his name is Ali Al-Ahmed, and he is the director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs, and he was born in Saudi Arabia. And Ali, it's good to have you on the program tonight. Again, like our other three guests here in the studio in Toronto, yours is a face familiar to our viewers over the years. You've been on this program before, and I want you to start by telling us, from your understanding, the protests in Egypt, the protests in Tunisia, what impact do you see them having in your native Saudi Arabia?
My country is probably one of the most affected by the Egyptian revolution, not as much by the Tunisian revolution, but by the Egyptian revolution, because we have to realize since the 1950s until the mid to the end of 1980s, everyone who went to school, including myself, was most likely taught by an Egyptian teacher. So Egyptian culture, language, and accent and demeanor was very familiar to us. So we feel so connected to it because those people who taught us to read and write and to do math might now be teaching us how to revolt. So there is a lot of sympathy within the popular segments of society with the Egyptian people and the revolution, and that has been took many forms. On the other hand, the government and its cronies have been extremely worried about what's taken place in Egypt. As I told your producer, Egypt, I describe it as the mother of the Arabs. So whatever happens to your mother, it will affect you. But especially in these countries where many Egyptians come to work and have taught us from first grade until university level, people are hopeful. They even started a Facebook group. In Egypt, they say people want to overthrow the regime. In Saudi Arabia, it's not as extreme. They say people want to reform the regime. Of course, the Saudi regime or the Saudi monarchy is not really interested in any reform. But this has not taken on the same impact like in other countries like Jordan and Yemen, for example. It's still very early. The effect has been limited so far.
Okay, Thabit, I'm going to follow up with you now. Iraq, of course, your native land, has already a functioning, let's call it a functioning democracy at this point.
Yes,
it's not a Jeffersonian democracy yet, but it's ahead of many of its neighbors in that regard.
That's true.
So what impact do you see the protests in Egypt having in Iraq?
Already it's had a tremendous impact. It's true what you say. The voices coming out from activists in Iraq is that if we don't like our government, we can change it the next time around. And this is an important difference, even though there are all kinds of problems of corruption and mismanagement and so forth. But the demonstrations, especially as they have now taken a focus in Egypt, are not only raising issues of elections, but they are combating a terrible cancer that has devastated the region, which is corruption. And in this regard, it has had a huge impact. There have been demonstrations in Baghdad, in Basra, in several of the other cities against corruption. And there's been an immediate response.
Against the corruption of the Iraqi government?
Yes, against corruption within the Iraqi government. There's all kinds of accusations of embezzlement, of funds being illegally channeled into the pockets of those with power. A similar phenomena has been the sudden spread of very shady businessmen who are very close with men in power who embezzle money. But there's been an immediate response. There are now committees that are responsible for checking on corruption. The Prime Minister, the President, and others in the government have declared that they're willing to take a massive cut in their salaries. These are symbolic, there's no doubt about that. But that the issue now is being raised, and there's a very clear fear on people in power of the anger from the streets, bodes well for some reforms.
Any sense of pride, do you think, among Iraqis that they look around the rest of the Arab world and say, we got here first. We've started a democracy first, and hopefully it's spreading.
Yeah, this could be more than it has been, but the problem in Iraq that has dampened some of the excitement about democracy has been the difficulties of everyday life. And this is part of the demonstrations. Part of the demands that we hear now is demonstrators, asking why is it that we still don't have the electricity and water, and they immediately refer to corruption as being the chief culprit here. So it's the difficulty of the security situation, the everyday services, even though they have improved greatly, as we had a program on that once.
Mm-hmm. Take some of the shine off the pride you might otherwise have.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
There are 2 dates that are being bandied about these days, 2 years actually. 1979, 1989. Roger Cohen wrote about this in the New York Times today. Let me read a chunk of what he had to say. The core issue in Egypt can be boiled down to this. Are we witnessing Tehran 1979 or Berlin 1989? Is this a broad uprising against dictatorship whose goal of democratic freedom will be usurped by organized Islamists, as in the Iranian Revolution? Or is this the end of the Arab Jurassic Park, where from Yemen to Tunisia, aging despots have ruled, and the start of a democratic flowering as world-changing as the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Okay, let's get into some discussion about this. Ali Al-Ahmed, to you first. 1979 versus 1989. Do you have a view on where we are and whether this analogy works for you?
Mr. Cohen, I think, is not familiar with the region very well, because what happened in Egypt did not look like the Iranian Revolution. In Iran, they had a religious leadership which was pushing and leading the revolution in the name of Ayatollah Khomeini and other leading clerics. In Europe, in Eastern Europe, the United States and Europe in general was supporting this revolution, and it was receiving massive aid from the West. In Egypt, this is a local, homegrown revolution that did not receive any aid from any other country, and it does not have an Islamist tone to it. Vice versa, it is young people who are techno-savvy, who are not particularly religious in their outlook. You see the people, the names of the people who have died in this revolution. They are mostly young people in their 20s and female and young women who do not wear hijab. You don't see any religious leaders. In fact, in Egypt, the Salafis, the traditional Muslims in Egypt, came against the revolution, and through their support behind the government of Mubarak, to the degree one of them issued a fatwa allowing the killing of Mr. Muhammad al-Baradei because he said he wanted to run against Hosni Mubarak. So no, this is not like Iran or like Berlin of 1989. This is a unique revolution that I believe will set its own course, because this is really the people's revolution.
Mohammed, what do you think of this 79 versus 89 analogy?
Well, I agree they're very, very different. Both 79 and 89 involved, or we could say, ideological revolutions. In Iran, you have an ideology of the rule of the jurist, whereas they wanted to establish a clerical government. In 1989, there was an overthrow of a communist regime in favor of a democratic regime. What's going on in Egypt, I think, is very unique, because when you look at what the protesters are demanding, they're really just demanding, very simply, that the Egyptian government respect its own law and its own norms of legality. Because the Egyptian state has a veneer of legality and democracy. It's just that the Egyptian government, at every opportunity, subverts it, right? And so now, basically what they're doing is saying, we want the law to apply to everybody uniformly across the board, right? And we want to see an end to the to subversion of law through formal legal rules. As we saw, the last election in Egypt was totally a fraudulent election. It was used to pass amendments that essentially constitutionalized the dictatorial powers of Mubarak and the emergency law. And so it's a protest against the illegality of the regime who's used the trappings of law to further their own personal and private ends.
So you're not sure the analogy works?
Not at all. But it's a revolution, but it's an odd revolution because it's trying to actually reclaim the legitimacy of the state that the people in charge of the state have totally subverted.
Okay. Shahid.
I think it's a unique revolution. 2011 Egypt is really not comparable to Iran or to East Europe. But I think there are lessons learned, and I think it's important to reflect on the experiences of both revolutions and to see how those lessons can help the Egyptian revolutions and the rest of the Arab world. But I think it's important to know this is really a very grassroots, organic, authentic revolution driven by suffering of Egyptians on the day-to-day lives. I mean, the corruption, as was referred to, the nepotism, the regime has managed to amass such an incredible amount of wealth, and the regime has its own militias of business people who have really benefited from the regime. So they've built a class of Egyptian families that their interests are connected to that of the regime. And that's what people are against: the brutality of the police, you know, the detentions, the political prisoners. I mean, the military rules. There is emergency laws have been in place in Egypt since as long as Mubarak has been in place. So that's what the revolution is there.
Thabit, Roger Cohen's thesis is taking a bit of a beating here. Are you going to stick up for him, or?
No, I'm
you
not
with
going
these
to
guys?
stick up for him, but
No?
I don't think it's completely irrelevant either. I'm perhaps a little more cautious than my colleagues about the developments in Egypt. Of course, I am extremely enthusiastic about it. I'm very happy. But there are lessons to be learned from the Iranian case.
What's the biggest one?
I don't think it's completely a different situation. There are, of course, uniqueness to Egypt. There are differences from one Arab country to another, even though in general there's a common phenomena here. What I fear is that these regimes in the Arab world are quite powerful, as was mentioned. That their base of support has shifted from the military to several layers, several types of security apparatuses, which are incredibly loyal to the regime and very powerful. I mean, combined, if you take the combined number of the various security apparatuses in Egypt, they number about 500,000, which is
1.5 actually.
well, yeah, whatever the case, they are perhaps the same strength, if not more so, than the army. What I fear is that if this regime continues to hold out and continues to reject the demands, even the simple demands of the Egyptian people, and they have been, I agree, they've been rather restrained. Change, liberty, social justice. I mean, these are the three points that are raised. If they continue to hold out, and if the demonstrators become more and more desperate, then more radical elements will come to the fore. What the calls will be, already you hear this, that demonstrations are not enough. Perhaps we should move into civil disobedience, which is something that I think would be fine. But then the next step after that, what happens if this doesn't work? What happens if the regime is even stronger than we might expect? It is at that point where the demonstrators become really desperate, that the more demagogic, the more reactionary, if I could use the word, the more fascistic elements will come to the fore. And this is what, excuse me, what Islamic extremism is in a way. It is local fascism in the garb of religious fanaticism.
Well, let me go back to Washington, and I want to, Ali, push back a little bit against what you just said before. I appreciate that you feel that this is a unique and distinctive revolution that's happening in Egypt right now. But let me push you on the 1979 analogy. If we were, and I'll admit here that my recollection of what happened 2 weeks in after the Shah was deposed in 1979 certainly won't be as good as yours, and maybe not as good as it ought to be right now. But my recollection is that it was not a slam dunk that the Ayatollah Khomeini was going to take over. There was still people were trying to figure it out still 2 weeks in as to who was going to assume the power vacuum. So how can you be sure? Admittedly, there's no Ayatollah Khomeini in Egypt right now who's been waiting in the wings for 25 years to take over. But how can you be sure that 1979 is not replicating itself in 2011 in Egypt right now?
Well, I have been grown familiar with the people who are leading this revolution in the past few weeks, and found out that the Islamist Party, although organized, does not have the support that it needs to take over, Egypt. The majority of the Egyptian people do not like to have a religious-based regime. You have a substantial Christian minority that is participating in this revolution, and I agree with you in one point that the regime, the new government in Egypt, that if this revolution succeeds, will be maybe friendly to Iran. It will become more populist government than the current government right now, that is a military dictatorship. But it will not reach that level of Islamist and ideological government, because the foundations for that does not exist in Egypt. There is not a strong religious establishment like they have in Iran before even the revolution. The power of the religious establishment in Egypt is not as that it was like Khomeini and other ayatollahs. And even then in Iran, it took a lot of time for them to take power. After the revolution, that is. In Egypt, these ingredients do not exist. The secular forces are much more powerful, and there is substantial military forces there that will not I think the West will not allow that to happen.
Okay, Mohammed, before I get you to comment on that, I want to play a little clip from a gentleman we had on the program last night, Abbas Milani, who is a highly regarded scholar focusing on Iranian affairs, and he was telling us last night, be very careful about what you wish for once this revolution has actually kicked in, because once the power vacuum is there, you never know who's going to enter. Michael, let's play that clip and then we'll come back and chat. Rotate, please.
Do your due diligence in finding out what the leaders who claim to be democratic stand for. Do not be fooled by their promise of democracy now. See whether they have lived a democratic life and whether they have in the past been democratic, whether they are democratic within their own organization, whether they have a plan for the future of Egypt. Do not be beguiled by empty promises now, because when a crisis like this exists, when the millions are in the streets, anybody can promise democracy, as Khomeini did.
Okay, Mohammed, be careful of those who are promising democracy today. That's his advice based on what he learned in 1979. What do you think of that advice?
Well, I mean, again, I think in and of itself, it's perfectly prudent. But I want to go back to the point that I mentioned. This is not a revolutionary movement in the sense that the Iranian revolution was revolutionary, or the solidarity in Poland was revolutionary, or the Bolsheviks were revolutionary, or even the French were revolutionary in the late 18th century. Because this group of protesters, I call them revolutionaries, but they're not revolutionaries in the sense that they want to overthrow the legal order of the state. They're revolutionaries in the sense that they want the state to respect the legal order that it supposedly applies.
They just want Democrats in there.
Yes,
Small D Democrats.
they want a regime that respects the law, right? They're not trying to overthrow the legal order, right? So, this is where I think is, again, a very important point to understand. The basic institutions of the Egyptian state enjoy legitimacy among a broad cross-section of the Egyptian population, including the vast majority of the Muslim Brotherhood. So when Ali Ahmed mentions Salafis in Egypt, they're such a marginal group, it's sort of hard to understand who exactly they are. I mean, the vast majority of sort of mainstream Muslim Brotherhood people, right, don't challenge the basic legitimacy of the Egyptian constitution or the Egyptian civil code, for example. There's no desire to rewrite Egyptian constitution from beginning to the end. The main demand, and this is why you can have a broad-based coalition, is that they're all united around the idea of let's all respect the law. Right?
Okay, but Jihad, I don't have to tell you that there, I mean, starting, we've already heard it from Prime Minister Netanyahu in nearby Israel, who has said, we're very fearful of a power vacuum because, well, he's concerned that the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, if they're as extreme as they were 70 years ago, might try to fill this vacuum, and then it's one person, one vote, one time. Is that a legitimate concern?
Well, I think the question is that what's good for the Egyptian people? I think we have to give the Egyptian people the opportunity to exercise that particular freedom. I think it's shocking the amount of people who are saying democracy is good for Israel and for America, but it's dangerous for the Egyptians. I think that's very dangerous. It's very hypocritical. It's trying to speak through your both. There are concerns not only in Israel. There's the Middle East is a lot more than Israel, and certainly the interest of Israel shouldn't be really how we frame this
No, I get you,
and
but
how we
who's saying,
understand that.
who's saying that right now? Who's saying America can have democracy, Israel can have democracy, but Egypt can't?
Well, actually, this is a quote from
John McCain?
This is a quote from Nicholas Kristof, actually, saying that it's incredible the number of people who are saying these things, and it's happening. And in fact, we are
who's
seeing
saying it?
more and more. Many people are saying that because they're saying that this could be bad for Israel or could be bad for the interest of the West. It's important to remind ourselves that a lot of the problems that is happening in Egypt, a lot of the reaction to the Egyptian regime, because it exactly served the purposes of the West and not its own people. So we actually have to listen to the Egyptian people. And I think a democracy, stable democracy with the Muslim Brotherhood, with the Wafd, with the Tajamma, with the National Party, can provide stability and provide an example to the entire region. I mean, Israel is one part of it, but it's not the entirety of it, and we shouldn't really judge this by what's good for Israel. I think that's kind of, outrageous.
For sure, but I've got to follow up on this again. I don't hear anybody, and I certainly haven't heard any of the four of you tonight say that, it's okay to have democracy in the United States, it's okay to have democracy in Israel, it's not okay to have democracy in Egypt. I hear everybody saying
that's the undertone of the entire debate.
Everything I'm hearing says the whole world would love, not the whole world, most of the world would love nothing more than to see a liberal democracy in Egypt. You hear that too, surely, don't you?
Yeah, of course. But it is telling.
The question is, do you have to be careful about what people are promising at this point? People promise a lot.
Yes, there are groups in the Middle East and outside that are fearful of greater popular. A greater role for the popular will in the government of Egypt.
People are fearful of an Islamist group taking over.
Well, when this demonstrations began to take place, you quoted Mr. Netanyahu in Israel. There were two other states that came out very forcefully in support of Mubarak: Saudi Arabia and Libya. And they make for a very odd group, those three. I think this was a very foolish statement on the part of Israeli leaders. It seems to me that it's much better for everybody concerned to come out with some kind of a general statement as to, we hope that this will go in a peaceful manner, that there won't be bloodshed, and that the will of the Egyptians will be served, etc.
And stay out of it.
And pretty much stay out of it. But there is something that should be mentioned about the question of Israel and its relationship with Egypt. I think it's a legitimate issue to raise in terms of the changes that are taking place. The present treaty between Egypt and Israel is extremely unpopular in Egypt. This is for sure. I mean, I've lived in Egypt for 4 years, and I've taught there, and it is unpopular. This doesn't mean, however, that there is an equal popular will to declare war. Likewise, the Egyptians do not want to go to war. But I believe that if there is a genuine democracy that's established in Egypt, that the exact relationship with Israel will have to be revisited and renegotiated. And this is something, of course, that will mean a shakeup for the existing structures.
Mohammed, you wanted to follow.
Yeah, I mean, just about your point, are there voices that are very concerned and upset about developments, even sort of worried about developments in Egypt? I think, especially to our neighbors in the South, I think that's basically the talking points of the Republican Party. I mean, John McCain, Sarah Palin, Bill O'Reilly, right? And we can dismiss them, right? But these are very influential voices in the United States, essentially creating fear that this is a smokescreen for another Iranian revolution, which I think on any kind of objective analysis of the social forces and the political forces in Egypt is really absurd. Now, just to follow up on what Professor Thabit was saying, I really think this is an opportunity for the entire region, including Israel. In my opinion, Zionism ultimately remains rooted in fear. Fear of anti-Semitism, fear of what non-Jews want to do to Jews. And this revolution in Egypt, first and foremost, is overcoming fear. It's very hopeful. It can create a new reality in the region that everybody will benefit from. So I would encourage Israelis to rethink their own ideology that constructs their relationship with their neighbors and think about what kind of hopeful coexistence can come out in the Middle East. Do they really want a relationship with their neighbors that is based purely on security? A relationship based purely on security is always based on fear. And if that's where you start, you're never going to get beyond that. This revolution is about liberating oneself from fear. That's something everybody in the Middle East needs.
Actually, Ali, if there's one thing I keep reading in the Israeli media and hearing about from members of the Jewish community here in Toronto, for example, it's that they're thrilled. They're thrilled that something is going on in the Arab world that has nothing to do with Israel, that Israel has not actually been a part of this story at all. Would you agree with that, that what's going on there right now actually has nothing to do with Israel and the Israelis should just watch it and see what happens?
I think the Israelis should watch it and accept it. They should not be afraid and worried too much, because I would thought that the world, led by the United States, would be supporting this revolution to make sure the extremist element will not have a stronger role to play in the future. Yeah. This is good for everybody. Imagine if we have a free, democratic Egypt. It will be much better for the United States. Yes, the government of Egypt, if democratic, will not be a stooge for the United States like Mubarak was, and it will not serve the interest of the United States without question. It will have its own national interest to account for its parliament and its people. But the chaotic nature of the Middle East is caused by despotic regimes. And when people say, this is going to be chaos after Mubarak leaves, 30 years of Mubarak rule, it was chaotic, because the people of Egypt have been suffering tremendously under him and under other rulers. So now we must come to the acceptance in the West that we need to support the people. Even if we don't like these new government's policies, we have to think of the long view that democratic governments tend to be much more stable and much more beneficial to other democratic governments. And if, for example, we talk about Muslim Brotherhood, it would have been better if the Muslim Brotherhood were in the government, because this would make them much more moderate and make them much more responsible. And other extremist elements, not only Muslim Brotherhood. And Muslim Brotherhood is not really extreme by Middle East standards, because they happen to be the most moderate Muslim Brotherhood copy in the Middle East. So yes, I think the Jews around the world should support this, because it is good for them as well, because democratic people are less likely to be anti-Semitic and violent and go into wars, and that is evident by democratic countries around the world.
Okay, Jehad, let me ask you to comment on the role the American government has had so far. And we've talked about the analogies to 1989, where I think it's an accurate rendering of history, that the Americans were right in there urging all those Eastern European Warsaw Pact countries to get rid of their shackles and to become as free as they were. Do you think the Obama administration is leading a similar charge this time around as it relates to the Arab world?
Not at all. In fact, the Americans caught completely by surprise by what's happening. They haven't had any indication that this was going to happen. And that's the beauty of this revolution. It was totally spontaneous.
Well, same thing 20 years ago. They didn't
But
know
the
the wall was going to
Americans,
come down either.
if the Americans had any plan to respond to it, this plan has been quite incoherent. There's been mixed messages. The administration is trying to speak from both sides of the mouth.
So you're critical of Obama's handling of this?
I think so. The best thing is that we said the West is best helpful when they keep out of this. Just watch and wish the people all the best. Extend
hang on,
solidarity
hang
and
on.
limit your intervention. So they tried to do too many mixed, confused things, so they ended up doing nothing really.
Well, hang on, Jay, how does that
There might
fare?
be
I mean,
expectations
hang
of
on.
the Obama
Obama was
administration.
on the phone within 2 days calling Mubarak and saying, you know what, you got to do something. You got
Well,
to
I
go.
told him you got to leave now, but he really didn't leave. So they didn't really know. And Secretary Clinton had a different message. The Republicans had completely, a different message.
was the
So I
different
think
message
I think
that
the
sent-
Americans do not have a coherent response to what's happening in Egypt.
What
I
was
think-
the different message that
I think
Secretary Clinton had from the president?
Well, the president said that the transition has to happen now, or the president have to leave now. And then Secretary Clinton said there has to be an orderly transition and has to be a process, and the president is part of it. So
Those
I
are not
think
necessarily mutually exclusive.
Well, I think the expectation was that Obama was asking for an immediate end of the Mubarak regime. But they ended up, I think there is, at the very best, there really is a confused policy. And that really underscore the reality in the Middle East
Okay,
as
Thad,
far
what
as
do
the
you say?
Americans are concerned.
I agree with much of what my colleagues have said, but I disagree on this point. I think generally speaking, what the American administration has done is the best one can hope for in this regard. If the United States gets too involved, I think it might discredit the revolutionary process. On the other hand, the Obama administration, I think, has clearly not backed Mubarak, and I think this is all that one can hope for in this regard. To me, I think the United States has done the right thing. The fact that the revolution is unfolding so rapidly, and there's been many twists and turns, of course there will be some tensions and contradictions in terms of statements from any country observing this. But in general, I think the Obama administration has shown very clearly that it is sympathetic with the revolutionary process. One thing that I am critical of, though, when we look at the United States, is the media. I think
Okay, hold off on that. We're going to get to
Okay.
media, but given that he's in Washington, I want to get Ali's opinion on how he feels the Obama administration has reacted to everything that's happened over the last couple of weeks. So tell us, Ali, what do you say?
Well, I've watched them very closely, and I actually was in the State Department a couple of days ago trying to gauge their policy. And the policy, maybe our friends in the North are not, maybe because they're not here, the policy was to support Mubarak covertly, but given an impression that they are sympathetic to the revolution. Let us remember, Obama called Hosni Mubarak twice before he gave, or after he gave the speech, and he called him President Mubarak. And this is very clearly lending a legitimacy to a person who was killing and shooting his people on the street. You don't do that. This is lending support and legitimacy.
Well,
and this
what
is
should he
very
have done?
clear in international policy.
What should he have done, Ali?
He should not call him. He should not call him. He should not have called him. He should have talked to somebody else. Talking a president of the United States, calling another leader who's shooting his people in the streets, that's legitimacy and support. Calling him President Mubarak several times in your speech, that is support.
Well, hang on. That's
First,
only
they
looking at half the.
wanted-
Hang on a sec, Ali, because that only looks at
The
half the
American
equation.
policy-
The other half. Forgive me. The other half of the equation. Stand by. The other half of the equation was, Hosni, you can't go into the streets and start shooting your people either. We will not allow that. Now he's got to get some credit for telling him
No,
that,
they
doesn't
didn't
he?
say that. I think they
Hillary
were worried
Clinton said
about
it.
losing
Obama
their
said it.
investment.
Who didn't say it? Everybody said it.
Like I said, publicly that was the statement because they needed to protect their image. But privately, they sent in Mark Wisner, and he spoke, and he came back, and he slipped in the Munich conference and said, we need to support Mubarak. If Hillary Clinton said he needs to be there to oversee the reforms, how can be a person who's been there for 30 years stay and reform after 30 years? Like they say in America, you cannot teach an old dog new tricks, and this guy is very, very old. The U.S. policy right now is like this. They want Mubarak individually to leave, but they want to maintain the Mubarak regime. His jackals will stay in power. This is the American policy. They are not fully behind. Not only today, they have called, for example, for the end of the military or security, state of security in Egypt. They had 12 or 13 days and they did not do that. It's very clear to me that their policy is, you know, we rather have somebody we know, Mubarak, we're gonna get Mubarak 0.02 in the individual or of Mr. Suleiman. That's why now he is the guy they call now. They don't call Mubarak anymore, and because they want to maintain this regime that Mubarak and Sadat built, because they are extremely worried about the peace treaty with Israel. The Saudi government, for example, has, you know, they made phone calls to Obama. Saudi king called Obama, and the Saudi ambassador in Washington has been running across Congress, talking to many senators and congressmen, and say, please, please, do not abandon Mubarak.
Okay,
Mubarak
Ali, let me get some
individually
wisdom
but
here in the
regime could
studio
stay.
here. Mohammed, go ahead.
Steve,
Do you share that view?
I'm more or less totally on board with Ali's position. What would impress me, right? Let me just back up. This revolution is about two primary things: torture and corruption. Okay, and the United States is backing the torturer-in-chief of Egypt.
You know,
that made
I
Egypt
got to tell you, you said that the other day. You said that. Hang on one second.
Infamous for rendition.
Hang on one second. You said that the other day, a week and a half ago on this channel, and then we had Janice Stein from the Monk School on after that, and I put to her that appellation. I said, you know, the guy they put in here, Suleiman, isn't he the torturer-in-chief? Because that's what Mohammed Fadl calls him. She says that is a wild exaggeration. You can't say that about this guy. He isn't.
Well,
And
that's certainly the reputation the American media gives of him. There's an incident in a Time magazine report where the U.S. asked Suleiman to get a DNA sample from a Zawahiri relative, and he joking, I don't know if it was joking, I assume it was a joke, he said, how would an arm do? Right? So this person seems to be quite comfortable with the idea of torture, and in the WikiLeaks it said that he enjoys some rough stuff personally. And so this is from a cable from a U.S. embassy official to the United States government. So I think it's deeply insulting to an Egyptian revolution, one of whose main values is the repudiation of torture, which is criminal in the Egyptian law.
To have this guy
To
in
have
there.
this guy as the president, right? That's one thing. Second thing is the immense corruption of the Mubarak family and his cronies, right? I would really be impressed, for example, if I were to hear the United States make demands and say that, you know, we are going to freeze assets of the Mubarak family in the United States. That would impress me, right?
Absolutely.
That would impress me.
You haven't
That would
heard that
support
yet.
the
They did that
Egyptian
with
people.
other
But I haven't heard
countries.
anything about that, right?
So you're waiting,
They did that with other countries,
They did that
like
with
Ivory Coast
with Ben
and
Ali
Haiti.
too. Yeah.
but we haven't seen that
We
yet.
haven't
in
seen
this-
that
And they
at all.
canceled visas, for example. They
Yeah.
didn't cancel anybody's visa.
I mean, it sounds to me like they're preparing a very nice, cushy retirement for the Mubarak family.
Where?
He would be welcomed in Washington for sure. I mean, the United States is in a bind. I mean, it is their best friend in the Arab world, after all, who's being unraveled now. So they are really worried. They're obviously unsure about who's going to follow after him. I think Omar Suleiman is a better choice for the
Do
Americans.
you think he's the torturer-in-chief?
Well, I think he is the chief of the Egyptian intelligence, which is really the movement or the institution that has really instituted the matrix of control over the Egyptian people. The Egyptian intelligence is very notorious for all kinds of things. Omar Suleiman is the head of it. If not himself, at least he's the head of it. So perceptionally, for the Egyptian people who are demonstrating on Tahrir Square, he's not a wise choice.
Okay, let's give Thabit. Let's go where you wanted to go a few minutes ago, and that is your view of the American media and how you think they've played this.
Yeah, you know, I agree with this what's just been mentioned about Amr Suleiman and how he's viewed in Egypt.
Okay, running out of time here though, so let's get on to the media.
All right. To me, the big problem is the alarmist notion that the media has taken this. The fact that it exaggerated the negative possibilities, especially when we compare it
Who did
with,
this? You can't talk about the media. Who did this?
No, but in the main newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, there is a constant alarm bells ringing about the possibility of this thing going to the right, becoming more reactionary. And I think it's a legitimate concern. But when one compares that with the uprisings in Eastern Europe, or even in Georgia, for example, the media generally applauded these and had a far rosier outlook.
You don't think the media is applauding right now? You see all these live pictures on CNN, MSNBC.
I think most recently it's become more positive, but especially toward the first week, there was an incredible amount of concern that tended to be the chief focus of where is this going. Whereas in Eastern Europe, there was generally a more positive outlook as to the uprisings there.
Listen, I don't know, but I'm guessing that when it came to Eastern Europe 20 years ago, they were throwing off their chains against communism, with whom we'd been in a Cold War for 50
Exactly.
years.
Yes.
So it was
Yes,
a simpler
that's true.
story.
Yeah,
the narrative
that's
this
very
time
true.
is a little more complicated.
That's
Would you agree?
Sure. That's true.
So,
Yes.
okay. Ali, how about you? On the American media, how do you think they've handled the story so far?
I think in the beginning they were very fearful because in Washington the Egyptian and other allies of Egypt have propagated that if Egypt Mubarak goes, it is going to be the Muslim Brotherhood. But when this continues for a few days and the anchors went to Egypt and they saw a different story, so you saw a different narrative. You know, you look at Fox and CNN, for example. Fox continue to say it's going to be chaos after Mubarak. CNN has changed that narrative because they saw on the ground. And they have a very wise and very good reporter in Cairo, Ben Wiedemann, who understands Egypt probably better than any other Western reporter. And I think he corrected that narrative for them. You would see the right wing media in the United States are very alarmist, and the left wing came around. I think when you see AC 360, Anderson Cooper, he's basically a heart-bleeding liberal who is pushing and hoping for this revolution to succeed. So you have a mixed narrative in the American media. It was not in the beginning, but now you see it very clearly.
I must tell you that from the last, I guess it was a few days ago, when people like Katie Couric were getting beaten up in the streets, there was a CBC crew that was beaten up in the streets. Beaten up for Katie Couric's probably too harsh. Jostled, certainly. It's pretty hard to say that the American media hasn't been on board with the revolutionaries here, isn't it? I mean, Mohammed,
if I could just make a distinction, I think there's a distinction between the rhetoric of the punditocracy and the coverage of your actual line reporters who are out in the field covering the story. I think the coverage of the people out in the field covering the story has been excellent, right? I think the commentary from the punditocracy has been shameful, for the most part.
In what parts
like
in particular?
on op-ed pages.
No, I get you. What in particular have you seen that's distressed
I think there's been an overemphasis on what this means for every party except the most interested party, the Egyptian people.
So they're worried more, how does this affect U.S.
How does it affect
Egyptian
US,
relations? How does it affect Israel?
How does it affect? How is it going to affect Saudi Arabia? Is it going to lead to greater instability in U.S. allies? Without really a focus on what were the costs? What was the cost of the Mubarak regime that the Egyptian people had to bear? Right? No concern about that at all among many commentators, especially on the right.
Let me ask a question that is occasionally asked of Jews and is occasionally asked of the Irish, and that is that at that moment in history, when, for example, Ireland or Israel really needed its diaspora to come through for them, the War of Independence, for example, in Israel in 1948, there was the Jewish community in this country and in the United States raised money, smuggled guns, volunteered, all of that kind of stuff. The same with the Irish, raised money, smuggled guns, and so on. Do we see that happening in the Arab diaspora today? Jihad,
well, we're not as homogeneous as we like to think. We're not that uniform. There are different views for this. I think the diaspora has a very important role and has to support, to be a voice.
How are they being supported?
I don't think there is a need for gun, and I hope there'll never be a need for gun, so we won't have to worry about sending guns to the Egyptians. I think there are ways of doing that, really trying to be a voice for the Egyptian people, because what's been missing really throughout this is that what is this means for the daily lives of average Egyptians.
So Thabit, maybe in a more self-explanatory way, helping
Well,
the rest of the world
agree with
understand it?
this. Yeah, and we see, for example, here in Toronto, there have been supportive demonstrations. There are teach-ins planned in University of Toronto and at York University. I think this is the main role that the Arab diaspora is playing here, and this is the only role it can really play.
Okay, with just a few minutes to go here, let me try one more thing. The day after 9/11, we all remember the Le Monde, the French newspaper, with that headline, "We are all Americans." Somehow that trauma made everybody, for a little while anyway, feel very sympathetic to the point that we were all Americans for a little while. Didn't last long, but it was there for a bit. Ali, to you first. How substantive is this "we are all Arabs" moment in history in the world right now?
I think it is that moment, because we saw this moment is where the true pan-Arabism it comes. It's not the pan-Arabism of Nasser and other leaders. This is the popular pan-Arabism. We feel the pain of the Egyptian people. We can associate with them, especially the Egyptians, because we grew up watching Egyptian television and programs. We were taught by Egyptians. So our connection to them is stronger probably than any other country.
Okay, let me get
And
Mohammed
we
on this.
feel
Forgive me,
their
I'm going to
pain.
cut you off
We
short,
we
Ali, because I
sympathize
want to
with
make
them.
sure everybody gets a chance. Go ahead, please.
Well, I think it is, if you're asking, when you say we're all Arabs now, if you're talking about like non-Arabs, I think Christoph made the, Nicholas Christoph's, whose coverage has been fantastic from the New York Times, he had a headline, "We're all Egyptians now." And I certainly think for lots and lots of people, there's been tremendous sympathy and sincerity and complete embrace of the Egyptian revolution.
How substantive do you think it is, Jihad?
I think it's quite substantive because it's very hopeful. And I think one thing that is so incredibly inspiring about what's happening in Egypt is that it's relative gentleness. With the exceptions of the government goons, I think it's been a very gentle, it's been very kind revolution that worth celebrating.
Thabit, last 20 seconds to
Yeah,
you.
a great deal of optimism on the part of everybody, but I am concerned that it can easily shift to incredible despair if this is really crushed. If the regime survives intact, then suddenly none of us will want to be Arabs.
Okay, I want to thank all of you for coming in tonight, sharing your views on a fascinating time in world history right now. Ali Al-Ahmed from the Institute for Gulf Affairs in Washington, D.C. As always, Ali, thanks for being on the program. Mohammed Fadel from the University of Toronto, Thabit Abdullah from York University, Jihad Aliwawi from Thorncliffe Neighborhood Office. Good of all of you to join us. Thanks so much.